No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Friends, on this Remembrance Sunday, we pay tribute to those who made the ultimate sacrifice, who gave their lives for their monarch, for their country, and not least, for us. It is because during the last century, people in this nation and other nations besides were willing to give everything, even their own lives, that we are now free from tyranny. It is because those who died and those who lived to tell the tale put duty and principle above the desire for self-preservation that we are still living in a democracy that for all its many failings still permits us great liberties, the freedom of speech, the freedom to hold differing opinions, the freedom to be ourselves. The freedom that we enjoy in this country and throughout Western Europe came at a price. And some of those who were willing to pay that price will be at services across the country today. Many of the veterans of World War II who are alive today were most probably teenagers when they signed up, 17, 18, barely grown up and in their young and tender years, and they will have witnessed awful horror and experienced personal and tragic loss, much of which, often silently, they will have carried with them and will do so until their dying day. So it is a privilege to be able to express my gratitude to those who still remain, and to honour as they do the many who fell. And yet, the sheer scale of their sacrifice is almost unimaginable today. There is scarcely a community in Britain that didn't lose someone in either the First or the Second World War. To hear those names read out in a small community, or to see at the Albert Hall the poppy petals fall, reveals a magnitude of sacrifice that is literally staggering. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. And there has been no greater laying down of life in the last 100, 120 years than that willingly embraced by the many who fell. Their sacrifice is a noble sacrifice. Their legacy is our freedom, our democracy, our way of life. Although a few could have been said to have been the victims of youthful enthusiasm, the vast majority who fell chose to embrace the possibility of death, believing it to be a price worth paying. Theirs was the greater love, for they chose to lay down their lives. I hope with all my heart that when old Father Time has claimed the lives of those who fought alongside those who fell, when the survivors of the Second World War have fallen victim to the gentle passing of the years, I hope that we who are left will continue to remember both the sacrifice that they were willing to make, as well as the many, many people who did make that sacrifice, who paid the ultimate price, and for our tomorrows gave their todays. And so I hope for them and for the many who've gone before them, for them all, I hope that the sun will never set on our acts of remembrance, and that the sacrifice that each have made will always be recognised. But I have to say this. I have to because it's true. None of them will have made that sacrifice alone. For in all the battles that we commemorate today, each of those who died was someone's son or someone's daughter, maybe someone's husband, wife, or fiancé, or even someone's mother or father. The casualties of war are not only to be found on the battlefield, they are to be found throughout our communities. The mentally and physically scarred, the bereaved, the widowed, the fatherless, those whose hopes for a bright future came to a sudden and tragic end. On this Remembrance Sunday, we need to remember that the armies who go to war are made up of people. Sons, daughters, wives, husbands, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters. And when their bodies are flown back, bagged up and ready for burial, we need to remember too that they did not make that sacrifice alone, but that there will be many who remain, who will pay the cost of that decision months, years, even decades after the actual event. But even they are not the only casualties of war. For one thing that the last century brought to our world was the concept of total war. In years gone by, when two countries were at war, their armies would fight it out until one or other army was defeated and a result would be declared. But 80 or so years ago, something utterly dreadful happened. We no longer confined war to being a battle between two armies, and we began to turn civilians into legitimate military targets. Last year we marked 80 years since the bombing of Coventry. In just one night, 449 bombers dropped around 30,000 incendiary devices, 64 light-capacity flare bombs, and between 1,200 and 1,600 high explosives and oil bombs, all on the city of Coventry. 568 people were killed, 863 were seriously wounded, 393 injured. The Nazis invented a new word for the destruction they caused. The city, they said, had been Coventrated. I worked in Coventry for 5 years, and I have to tell you that it wasn't just people and buildings that were destroyed in that raid. They bombed the hope out of that city. Even now, as a city of culture, it still had to regather its self-esteem that had been blown to smithereens. And yet Coventry wasn't alone. This deliberate incineration of Dresden, Hamburg and Tokyo, to name but some, were all given real meaning to the term total war. Innocent individuals going about their daily business became the victims of a war in which they played little part. Theirs was not a noble sacrifice, for they did not give up their lives were taken from them. And today, though their names are not inscribed in stone nor written on our proud memorials, we should remember them. My heart grieves for them in particular, for they are so often forgotten. Those who lost rather than gave their lives, those whose lives were taken away rather than willingly sacrificed. And yet the slaughter of innocent life goes on. For in our sophisticated age, it is so often the innocent civilian who becomes the victim of an act of military aggression. Those who died in the terrorist bombings of the UK and Ireland. The diners and shoppers and ordinary people who were blown to smithereens on the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. Those who died on 9/11 and 7/7. And of course the tens of thousands of civilians in Afghanistan who died since 2001, either directly or indirectly as a result of the war there. And in the Yemen, where almost 250,000 people have lost their lives since war began just 7 years ago. Causing the death of innocent civilians, whether as targets or as collateral damage, is totally and completely wrong. Their deaths, I believe, somehow diminish us, for they make us part of a world in which the most fundamental belief, the belief in the sanctity of human life, is undermined. We live in an age where war is not confined to the battlefield, but in which the weapons of terrorism and fear are used against ordinary people like you and I, and in which innocent civilians, often the elderly and women and children, become unwittingly caught up in misguided air-to-ground offences. I believe that we are right to wage a war against terrorism, but I believe that there is only one way to win such a war, and that is to cease being the bringer of terror and to start being the bearer of peace. Jesus said no one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. And he encouraged us to love our neighbour, even our enemy, because to do so established a principle that says that we must value another person's life as much, if not more, than we value our own. Just as sacrifice was a noble end for the many whom we remember today, so the self-sacrificing virtue of love must be our goal in life. Love that puts the needs of others before our own needs. Love that forbears all things and forgives people their failings. Love that refuses to be part of anything that restricts human life or subjects it to terrorism or fear. Love, perfect love, that actually casts out fear. And if you want an example of that love lived out, then look no further than Jesus. When he said, "No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends," he then said that we were his friends. And then he laid down his life for us. He gave himself up for us. He sacrificed himself because in so doing, he delivered us from the power of sin and death and enabled us to live lives in the light of his victory, a victory in which love, not might, not intimidation, but love conquers all. May we live as those who believe in the all-conquering power of love. Amen.